Hey everybody, it's Carl. Welcome back to another Terraria tier list. I'm still padding out some time as I'm still moving stuff, but let's just get straight into it. I'm ranking every single melee weapon in Terraria, starting from swords, going all the way to the others, including the Zenith and the Daybreak, stuff like that, categorized by how the wiki does it. So let's get straight into it with the wooden swords. I've grouped them all together because I'm going to put them all in C tier. I believe the wooden swords are just fine, you know. You can use them at the early game and it makes your life a little bit easier. But otherwise, you don't really want to see them. Next up is the ore short swords. I'm going to put all of the short swords in F because Jesus, who wants to use these? That's insane. Ore broadswords, I'm going to put in C as well, right alongside those other wooden swords. You don't really want to use those. All right, clearing up the space from all those extra things, we're going to move straight on to NPC drops and other kind of craftable things you can get or buy. First up, we've got the cactus sword, which I'm going to throw alongside all the other swords right in C tier. And then we have the umbrella, which I'm going to throw straight into... Next up is the umbrella, which I'm throwing straight into F tier because it's way better as a tool than it is a weapon itself. So that's the only reason why. Same goes for the breathing reed and same goes for the ruler. I will also be putting the stylish scissors in F tier because while you're using these, it's already hard enough to find the stylist as is. Now the katana you can actually buy from the traveling merchant. I'm going to put it just in C tier because there are better things you can get at the point where you're probably wanting to spend the money on the katana. If you get it really early and you have the gold for it, it's a nice little boost, but overall not too crazy. The exotic scimitar I'm also going to be putting in C. A lot of these pretty hard mode swords you're not going to be using a whole lot. Purple clubberfish, I think just out of necessity, I'm going to put it in C as well. It's actually pretty decent just damage wise, but it's such a hassle to get that I don't think it's worth it. The phase blades I'm going to put in C because they're not too hard to get, but again, at this point in the game, you're probably already got the best swords in pre-hard mode. Tragic umbrella, similarly, we'll go with the normal umbrella down in F tier. The fly meal actually does have a use here introduced in the newest update of Terraria. It lets you kill NPCs, which makes it a little bit easier to get their drops. Other than that, though, I'm going to put it in F because there is no combat use for it. And the Falcon Blade does not have enough range to make it worth it. I'm also putting it in F tier. Let me know if you disagree with any of these, of course, as always. Next up, we have the mob drops you can get from all of the mobs and or like presents, stuff like that. Starting with the zombie arm, C tier. Getting the zombie arm really early game can actually help go caving a lot, but not any more than some of these other swords could do for you. The bladed glove I actually want to put in B. One, because I'm a massive Freddy Krueger mark, and two, because with a super fast melee speed, you can actually cheese a couple bosses, and also it's just fun to watch. Mandible blade, similar to the zombie arm here. If you get it early, it can be nice, but otherwise, no real point. The gladius is, I think, F tier. I think I'm going to put Gladius in F tier. You don't really see it a lot. It's a rare drop, and overall, marble biomes are not that common, so there's no real use in using it. The bone sword, I'm going to put straight into C. I don't think you really want to use it. You really want the bone pickaxe if you're going to get anything from the skeletons. Candy cane sword, also go into C. The bat, I'll put in C as well, and same goes for the tentacle spike. I don't think any of these are especially good that you want to be using. Next up, we're starting to get to the good stuff here. The projectile swords. Now the projectile swords I think are actually super good. I think the ice blade is an easy B tier. If you can go straight into the ice biome and get a nice little projectile sword, especially in a swords only playthrough, you're immediately bumped up. And the same goes for the enchanted sword I'm going to put in B as well. Same rules apply. If you can get a shrine early and you get the enchanted sword, awesome. If not, there's also a much better option I think in the Star Fury, which I'm going to put in A tier. It's just one of the best pre-hard mode swords you can get right up until the best pre-hard mode sword. And with the Beekeeper, I think overall it's a better sword. It's a boss drop. I'm going to put it in B as well with the others, and it shoots bees, which is always a plus. And finally, we have the Knight's Edge materials. First up's the Light's Bane. I'm going to put in B tier. It has a nice little effect with the slash. The Blood Butcher I think is actually kind of worse. I want to put it in C, unfortunately. The Blade of Grass I actually really like a lot. I don't think I like it more than projectiles, so I'm going to stick it in B alongside the Light's Bane. However, the volcano I want to throw in A tier. I love the volcano. It has insane damage, and especially in big groups of enemies, the massiveness of this sword comes in super handy. The Muramasa is a sword I never find myself using ever. I grab it just so I can go ahead and make the Knight's Edge. So I'm going to throw it in C tier just because it's so late into pre-hard mode that you don't really ever want to use it. And then we have the Knight's Edge, which of course is going to go into S tier here. If we're looking at just the scale of pre-hard mode, this sword can easily take out even Master Mode Wall of Flesh. It's just so good. The circular thing, it can even last you through a good portion of hard mode as well. Speaking of hard mode, let's move on to the hard mode swords, starting with the stuff you can get straight out of the gate, the crafted swords. Starting with, of course, the Pearlwood sword. We're going to go straight into F tier. No one wants this thing. Next up is all of these, which I'm going to put all of these into F tier for the sole fact that there are so many better options you can get that don't require you to go mining for ore. And also they are just the basic swords. They don't really have any special properties to them or anything. They're just swords that you swing. They have decent damage, but you would much rather use the Knight's Edge over any of these up until you can get yourself the Excalibur. The Excalibur I think is very solid. I don't know if I want to put it in S. I think I do want to put the Excalibur in S though. I think the Excalibur is a very solid sword, especially in stuff like the Destroyer. It is very good compared to the Knight's Edge, but they're about on par, so I would consider them equal. The Chlorophyte Claymore I want to put in F tier as well, and the same goes for the Saber. One, because it's a hard mode short sword, and also you're getting Chlorophyte. You don't want either of these. You're not making these to use them ever. And same thing goes for the Phase Saber. You can get it very early on into hard mode, but the Knight's Edge is just way better. Moving on, we have the mobs and other category here with the Classy Cane from the Tax Collectors straight into F tier. The Slap Hand is a funny joke weapon, but also F tier as well. You're never really going to use that thing. The Ice Sickle I'm going to put in B, just because if you are using swords, you have these better options that doesn't require all these grinding and rare drop chances. The Ham Bat, we're going to go straight into C just because, I don't know, it's funny. The Frostband, I think similarly to the Icicle, you don't really want to farm for it, but it is decent enough, so I will put it in B just for that. The Cutlass, I'm going to put straight into F. The Pirates suck, and the Weapon sucks. Beam Sword, much like all these other ones, B tier. You never really want the mob drop weapons for these unless you are a big fan of how they look or just stylized. The Blade Tongue you can get pretty early on. I think I'm going to put it in C just because of how rare of the drop these fishing weapons are, and also how little use you will get out of them. The Fetid Bagnox, I think I actually want to put these in A. They had a little niche place with melee speed builds at some point. I think they're very funny to just see shred some of these hard mode bosses. The Death Sickle, from a pure aesthetic standpoint, this thing is fantastic, and I think is good enough for you to actually switch off of using some of the other weapons. So I will put it in A tier. The Key Brand, as good of a reference as it is to the old Kingdom Hearts, I think I want to put in F because you get it in the hard mode dungeon, where at this point you don't want a sword that basically does nothing. And the Psycho Knife kind of acts in a similar way to some of these, but I'm going to put it in B as the reference is cool, but again, some of these other things are just better, or you can get them earlier and they still outperform. Next up, we have the boss weapons that you can get, including all of these. And first up, we have the Breaker Blade. I'm going to throw it right in the middle here, B. If you can get it on the Wall of Flesh, it can be useful. However, I still think the Knight's Edge is a better choice to bring with you into hard mode. The Brand of the Inferno is not something you really see a lot, and especially because it's the Old One's Army, and the fact that the Old One's Army is actually kind of tough once you first get into hard mode, I'm going to throw it into C because you can easily get something else. Now, the Waffles Iron is a special item specifically for the Get Fixed Boy Seed. Once you defeat Mechadusa. So I'm just going to throw it in the F tier because I don't really think it's that useful. I don't really know what it does. The Seedler. I think this is a C tier. At the point you're fighting Plantera, you have infinitely better weapons, and its effect is kind of lackluster, but not as lackluster as the Horseman's Blade and the Christmas Tree Sword, both of which I'm going to throw straight into F tier for being borderline useless weapons alongside some of the short swords in the game even. Next up, we have the Influx Waver, which I also want to put in F just for the fact it exists as so late in the game when you have much better weapons and it only shoots out an enchanted sword-like projectile. That is a disgrace, but the next three are actually very good. I would put the Flying Dragon in A tier, just because one, it's one of the coolest looking weapons in the game, it does a lot of damage, and it has a wide projectile unlike the Influx Waver, and mainly it's just like, Betsy isn't too tough, so you can easily get it. It's also the Old One's Army though, so that's up to you. The Star Wrath, of course, I think I'm going to put in A tier. It's a wonderful weapon. It's very good, but I think the S tier of the Moon Lord swords is very obviously the Meow Mirror. Insane amounts of damage, nice projectile, a little annoying, but you get over that. It is easily the best sword in the game that you can get, which it better be because you have to do it after the final boss. Finally, we have the Terra Blade ingredients. Starting with the True Knight's Edge, this is straight up an S tier weapon. It is one of the hardest carries in the game. The True Excalibur I think is actually, I'm gonna say they're even. As much as I like the Knight's Edge a little bit more, the Excalibur has its place in hitting for more damage on stuff like the Destroyer as well as like Plantera. It is very useful. And of course the Terra Blade is also an S tier weapon because you can use it for a good portion of the game, and it eats through crowds of enemies, it eats through bosses. Up there with the Meow Mirror, the two best swords in the game, I believe. That's all for swords. Let's move on to yo-yos. Now with yo-yos, of course, you have a starting weapon, which is the wooden yo-yo, but it is terrible. So we will put it straight into the F tier. The wooden yo-yo's only real use is to let you grind for the Amazon, which I am going to put in the S tier for just how powerful it is in the early game compared to every other yo-yo you can get. So I think just from that, you get the wooden yo-yo, you go straight to the jungle, grind out the Amazon, immediate power boost, and you can take on most of the pre-hard mode bosses. It's kind of insane. Stuff like the Rally, I'm going to put in C just for being okay, but also being a very rare drop from Giant Shellys, Crawdads, and Salamanders. The Melees and the Artery, I'm going to put in C as well. They are just worse than the Amazon, so there's no real point in going for them. They are easy to get though, so there's always that. The Code 1, extremely rare yo-yo to get. If you can get it, I think it is actually worth. It is better than the Amazon and all of these others, but so being so rare, I can't put it any higher than B justifiably. The High Five I want to put into A tier from the fact that it spawns bees, as well as it's not too hard to get. The Queen Bee is a fairly easy fight. And it's a solid little upgrade. And next we have the Valor. I'm going to put in B tier because of the sole fact that you can get the Cascade just as easily, and it is a much better effect with the fact that it has a chance to inflict the On Fire debuff. I think it just makes it infinitely better. That's all for the pre-hard mode yo-yos. Please add more yo-yos, Terraria. Let's move on to hard mode. A lot more yo-yos to work with here. So let's start with the Format C. Sold by the Skeleton Merchant, it is, I think, a C tier weapon. There are a lot of these early game yo-yos that you can get that I think are just not worth it at all because either they have to be sold by the Skeleton Merchant or some other thing. So I think the Format C, the Gradient, and the Chic all go into C tier. And while that might seem a little bit harsh, that is only because of the Hellfire and the Amarok existing. I think the Hellfire I want to put in A tier, but the Amarok could go straight to S just for ease of being able to get it. Just summon some King Slimes in the snow biome compared to the underworld, and you have a immediate almost 20 to 30 damage buff on your yo-yos. It also inflicts Frostburn, which is a really good debuff, and I think it is up there with the Amazon in breaking the yo-yo game progression, which desperately needs a rework. The Code 2 I'm going to put in B tier. It is a lovely looking yo-yo, but it is sold by the Traveling Merchant similar to the Code 1, and I just think it is not worth it at this point where the Amarok is so good. The Yellets I'm going to put in A tier. It is a better yo-yo than the Amarok, but it doesn't break the game like the Amarok does. It doesn't deserve that S tier position. The 2 treasure bag yo-yos I'm going to put in B, just because you can get them early and get a nice damage boost as soon as you start grinding out some mech bosses or something. However, I think going for the Yellets or the Amarok is an easier route and takes far less time than trying to get these specific dev sets. The Kraken, I think Wooden Yo-Yo will finally get a partner in F tier. I think the Kraken is borderline useless in the game. It can only be gotten in the hard mode dungeon, which is after Plantera, but after Plantera you can go ahead and start the Solar Eclipse to get the Eye of Cthulhu, which is, of course, the best yo-yo in the game before the end game starts, before the post game starts. And to join it up there is obviously, it's the Terrarian. It's super broken, but it just is up there as a courtesy of being OP as shit. That's it for all the yo-yos. Let's move on to Spears. Spears is a very neglected class in the game, and it's one of my favorites as well. I used to have a Dragoon class playthrough that is now lost to the private section of YouTube on one of my other channels. Let's go ahead and get straight into ranking these. The Spear, straight up C tier. You can get it in wooden chests, and it actually gives you a weapon without needing to grind or break the rules any. The same goes for the Trident. They are very similar. Trident just does a little bit more damage. Now the Storm Spear is very good. It gives you a projectile in early pre-hard mode. I'm going to put it straight into A tier. I love the Storm Spear. It looks great. The projectile is nice, and it just gives you a little bit of power boost The rotted fork is just as easy to get as the spear and the trident, but it is better. I'm going to put it in B. You can easily go and get bombs from like a cave and just straight up hope you're lucky and don't even need to get the spear, trident, or storm spear and skip straight to the rotted fork if you want to. Otherwise, you know, it's a thing. The swordfish, I'm going to put in F tier. Fishing sucks and this spear sucks. It doesn't give you anything special. And the dark lance, I'm going to put in A tier with the storm spear just for the virtue of it being very good and can actually last you through a couple of bosses in hard mode. Speaking of, let's start with the hard mode spears. A little bit differently than the swords, I think the ore spears are actually worth getting your hands on, as the dark lance is good, but the dark lance doesn't really give you anything that makes it much more worth it than these other spears do. But I think I will put all of them in C and the adamantite and titanium in B tier, just for the highest amounts of damage you can get from those. But of course, you can always go and get the obsidian swordfish, which similar to the other swordfish is very low on range, but it has a very high amount of damage. I'm going to put in C alongside these. It is an option that you can go for. And next we have the Gungnir. The Gungnir is a fantastic spear, up there with the Dark Lance in being just good. It's going to be your main spear for a little bit until you get the Mushroom Spear. I think it's also A tier. I don't think any of these spears are particularly S tier. That's the problem. I think I will throw one in there just to say it is the best of the spears. But for now, the Ghastly Glaive, it is Old One's Army, but it is a very solid spear. Let's put it straight into B tier. The Chlorophyte Partisan is actually more useful than the other Chlorophyte things. I think I will put it in B as well, even though the Mushroom Spear or the other spears that you can get are a little bit better. And finally, the North Pole, just from the virtue of being probably the best spear you can get with its projectile. I think you put it in S tier, not one of my favorite weapons in the game, but it is objectively one of the best spears you can get. And unfortunately, that's all for spears. I really want spears to get a massive rework in one of these future updates, hopefully. It's just one of those neglected classes that needs a little bit of love. Let's go ahead and move on to Boomerangs. Boomerangs is a very difficult class to judge because of how similarly to spears, it's been kind of neglected. It did get some love in 1.4 with a few new additions that make it a lot easier in the pre-hard mode and early game. So let's go ahead and get into judging these. The wooden boomerang is an F tier weapon. You're not even guaranteed to get it. I know I had a failed boomerang playthrough where the first 3 hours was me looking for this wooden boomerang and never finding it until I found the skeleton merchant which sold it. One of the worst experiences of my life. But once you get one, you can upgrade it straight to the enchanted boomerang, which is pretty decent. I'm going to put it in C tier just for the fact that there is a better one that you can get if you are just lucky enough. Or you can grind for the Shroomerang, which I will put in B tier just above. It does a nice little bit of damage. It emits light similar to the enchanted boomerang, and you can get it in gold chest, or you can just grind it out from the spore bats in the glowing mushroom biome. And the ice boomerang will go alongside it from the fact you can get it from ice chests, and it does a similar amount of damage. The last of the traditional boomerangs that we could get is the Flamerang, which I will put in A tier. It is a very high damage weapon for boomerangs. It's not too hard to make. You do need the enchanted boomerang, but it has a chance to inflict on fire, and it also emits light, which is just a little bit of a plus. The Fruitcake Chakram, a Christmas time only boomerang, I'm going to put in C tier with the enchanted boomerang. 1, you need it to be Christmas, so you need presents around. And 2, it's just like not as good as the Thorn Chakram, which I'm going to put in A tier up with the Flamerang. It is a very, very good weapon. In my failed boomerang playthrough where I was fighting the Wall of Flesh, I swapped between it and the Trimerang because you can actually throw multiple boomerangs out at once if you didn't know. So I would throw 3 Trimerangs and then throw the 4th and 5th Thorn Chakrams before throwing back the Trimerangs and getting into a loop of just constant damage. It was actually very fun. The Trimerang is such a cool addition to the game, and I think it deserves a spot in A tier. And the Bloody Machete, I'm going to put down in C with the Chakram. For similarly, it can only be gotten during Halloween, and also it is just not that good when you can just get the Combat Wrench, which also I think deserves a spot up in A tier for being one of the best options against the Wall of Flesh in pre-hard mode if you don't want to use the Trimerang or other things. These are all fantastic options. Let's move on to the hard mode boomerangs. First up is the Flying Knife, a non-traditional boomerang. It actually follows your cursor around and can be held there. I think it deserves a spot in B. It can be very useful in that early game, but I think you really only want to be using it so that you can go and get the Bananarang. I'm going to put the Bananarang in S tier. Ever since they changed it where you only needed the 1 and you can throw all 10, it is just a fantastic weapon. And you can get it right into hard mode as soon as clowns are spawning during the blood moon. Now, of course, you can also avoid all of that if you are just lucky enough for your first traveling merchant in hard mode to supply you with the Sergeant United Shield. It does a ton of damage. It homes in on enemies. It's insane. I think it has to be S tier. I was debating putting it in A just for the fact that it is extremely rare and you have to get the Traveling Merchant, but it's just so good. Next up is the Light Disc. Functions similarly to all the other chakrams in the game. I'm going to put it in A tier. Has a nice chunk of damage, but you have to get through the destroyer first, which can be a little tough sometimes. And then you're left on a blank for so long in the game until you defeat Plantera, which lets you get the Paladin's Hammer. I think the Paladin's Hammer is very good if it was available earlier in hard mode, but once you're defeating Plantera, I don't think you really need weapons that can just pierce over and over again in enemies. And I think some of these other weapons are maybe a better choice, specifically the Possessed Hatchet up in S tier as what you'll be using up until you beat the game with Boomerangs. Homes in on enemies, does a lot of damage. This and the Sergeant United Shield are just very, very good. And that's all for Boomerangs. I think they did get a little bit of love. I think it's also one of those melee classes I would like to see get some more. So let's move on to Flails. First up, we have the Chain Knife. The Chain Knife is a rare drop from Cave Bats in pre-hard mode. I'm going to put it in C tier for the sole fact that if you're doing a Flails only playthrough, you can't even get it as your first weapon. And also, it's just not that great compared to some of the other easy Flails you can get, such as the Mace. I think the Mace is also a C tier, but you can just get it in golden chests anywhere underground and immediately turn it into the Flaming Mace, which is the same thing. It just has the on fire debuff, which it just makes it a little bit better. Next up is the Ball of Hurt obtained from Shadow Orbs. I think the Ball of Hurt goes straight into B tier as well. It has a pretty high jump in damage compared to the Flaming Mace and just range. I think it is better, but none of these flails are super great. The Meatball, however, is the Crimson counterpart, but you can only craft it. You can't get it from the orbs, which I think actually makes it a little bit worse. It has higher damage, but if you were doing a Flails only playthrough or in general trying to use Flails as your main weapon and you got a Corruption World, you can't even use it. And if you got a Crimson World, you can't even use it without needing to fight a boss, which sucks when you just have the Flaming Mace. Next up is the Blue Moon found in the dungeon, and of course we're going to put it in B tier as well. It does have a nice little damage boost, but I think at that point you just want to get the Shadow Key so you can go straight and get the Sun Fury, which I will put into A tier here. The pre-hard mode Flails are some of the worst weapons in the game, in my opinion. Even after their massive rework, I think you don't really want to be using them. The hard mode Flails, though, are a little bit different. The Chain Guillotine, I think, goes straight into F tier for being just absolutely terrible once you're in hard mode. Like, you don't really need this because you can just go get something else like the Tao of Pow, which you can just go get the Mummy Shards and some Souls of Night and Light and just make that, putting it into A tier. It's a very powerful weapon, 100 base damage with a chance to conflict Confuse. That's insane. The Anchor you can get from Pearlwood crates, and I think it is also going to go into C tier here. On the other end of the spectrum from Boomerangs, the KO Cannon I think is also pretty bad. I just feel like you don't want to use this. It's a little easier to use than some of the other Flails, but once you get used to Flails, I think it's not something you want to use, especially if you're doing full melee and you're fighting clowns and they just drop this over and over and over instead of the banana ring. I get a little annoyed. The Drippler Crippler involves fishing in the Blood Moon, which sucks. You have the chance to spawn the Dread Nautilus, which could just take you out if you're not careful. I think it is just going to go straight into C tier here. I would just use the Tao of Pow. The damage boost you get from this is not worth it. Next, the Flower Power drop from Plantera is just a nice little damage boost. I think goes into A tier here. The Golem Fist, I think I'm going to put in A tier. It is just a straight up better KO Cannon. Does a ton of damage compared to the KO Cannon. And you can use that to go get yourself the Flare-On, which is one of the classics. Back in 1.2.4, when Fishron was the main threat you're trying to take out, getting the Flare-On is just wonderful. It's a great feeling. It's so good. The Flare-On's one of the best weapons and one of my favorites in the game. That is all for Flails, however, so let's move on to the final category, all of the miscellaneous weapons, starting with all alone in pre-hard mode, the Terragrim, the pre-hard mode replacement to the Arcalis. It's one of those things where if you get it, you're a little disappointed because you're like, that could have been an enchanted sword, and I think the enchanted sword is unfortunately just better, but I don't think it's bad enough to be an F tier. You can use it for sure. So let's go straight into where the vast majority of these are, and that's hard mode. Look at all of these. First up is the Shadow Flame Knife, a throwing weapon that you throw and it bounces around. I actually really like the Shadow Flame Knife, but I think it goes into a B tier here. And the Arcalis is the Terragrim, but just a little bit better found with the dev set. I'm going to put it on par with it. It doesn't really deserve a higher spot. Its damage isn't much higher. Next, we have the 3 lances. I'm going to put all in F tier. You don't want to be using these things. They do have very high damage compared to some of these other things, but they're hard to use and overall not worth even touching. The Sleepy Octopod dropped from the Ogre in the Old One's army, I think is actually a very solid weapon. I'm gonna put it in B tier here, just for being in the Old One's army, stuff like that. And the Sky Dragon's Fury, I'll put in A, just for being better. You gotta beat Betsy to get it, which means you get a chance to get wings when you're trying to use it, and it is a very fun weapon to use with its little blast of fire out. Next up, we have the 2 chest weapons, the Scourge of the Corruptor and the Vampire Knives. The Vampire Knives have fallen from grace a little bit, but I think the Scourge of the Corruptor has actually taken its place as one of the fan favorite melee weapons. It's kind of slept on. It's so insanely good. You just farm out that corruption key and you've got one of the best random melee weapons you can get in the game. It's literally so good. And while the Vampire Knives have been nerfed quite a bit, they are still a visually awesome weapon, and the lifesteal is decent enough now, so let's just put them straight into A tier, just as, you know, you can get them and they can carry you through a little bit of something. Next up, we have the final categories of boss weapons and stuff like that, with the Starlight, a kind of short sword-esque weapon, except it has a long range and a very fast attack speed. When you're comparing to some of these other weapons, the Scourge of the Corruptor is probably what you'd want to be using until you defeat the solar pillars, but I think the Starlight visually appealing and has a nice chunk of damage. And now the Solar Eruption, I think obviously the Solar Eruption is just insane, and so is the Daybreak. They both deserve a spot in S tier. The Daybreak is almost kind of like the Scourge of Corruptor, almost like an upgrade to it, but these are both insanely strong, especially when you tie them with in-game melee gear where you're tanking and just doing tons of damage. But of course, the final weapon of the tier list, and the king of them all, is the Zenith. No one can doubt that the Zenith is S tier. It is only downside is that you can't do anything after you get it. And that's where modded comes in. If you're playing modded, this thing is insane nutty, but it's a fun little challenge to do. It's not very hard. The hardest part is just grinding out the Moonlord, but once you get like the Meow Me, or like I did in my Swords Only playthrough, you can just blow through them and eventually get yourself the Zenith before realizing it's not an actual sword and getting sad. That wraps up this Terraria tier list of every melee weapon in the game. Tell me what your thoughts were. Tell me if you disagreed on anything. Some of these melee weapons I haven't used since they got updated or since like 1.2. So just let me know if you think I'm wrong on any of these, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Love you guys. Bye.